Oofda. The Israeli-Palestinian-Hamas conflict is a big, complex, complicated, painful topic. And there's really no good take to have on it. But we just recorded a podcast episode with Cannon's Fodder on this topic, so I guess now is as good a time as any to cover it. Unrest in the Middle East is something that most people are aware of is a thing. But why is it a problem? And you've probably heard a lot of dumb shit that is in some way, shape, or form xenophobic. But to understand the real foundation of the problem, it's white people, again. It's always us. And to really get a handle on it, we need to go back a ways. Now, you could go back a really long ways, but the foundation of the modern problem really starts in 1917. It's the end of the First World War, and the Ottoman Empire that had lasted 1,000 years basically fell apart overnight. Their territories getting split up between the victors, as it goes when you lose a war. The main victors were the French and the British, and some of this territory included what is modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jerusalem. But you see, earlier in the war, it wasn't going super great for the Allies, because they were fighting an empire that had lasted 1,000 years, and they had some ass-kicking experience. So the British were like, hey, I got an idea. Let's make an agreement with the Sharif of Mecca, with the Arabs. If they help us not get our ass kicked so bad, we'll give them their own country, their own territory right around the Holy Land that they want. But also, wars are expensive, and they'd been doing it for a while, and they'd spent a lot of money, and they needed more. So the British were like, hey, I got another idea. Let's call up the Zionists. It was a movement of Jewish people who controlled a lot of wealth. They're like, hey, if you give us some money to help us win this war, we'll give you your own territory, your own country right around the Holy Land that you want. But that was the same Holy Land that they'd already promised to the other guys. And then because the French were also part of the Allies fighting this war, were a major power, and they wanted their piece of everything, the French and the British had already staked out their kind of pieces that they were going to get of the same land. When the war ended, there was like some conflicting claims for who gets the land. So the British decided that the solution to solve this dilemma was the solution they used to solve every dilemma: imperialism. So the British were like, we're just going to occupy the space, and the Jewish people can stay here, and then the Arab people can stay here, and we'll just put guys with guns here and be nice to each other. So that's what they did for a few years, and then Germany started getting all big for its britches again in the 1930s, and a bunch of the Jewish people living in the area were like, yeah, we're gonna go someplace else. A lot of them went to Palestine, which means now there's like some mass immigration refugee thing kind of going on, and that kind of started heightening more tensions between the Arabs and the Jews again. And then World War II happens, and we fight for a few years, and then we win. Hooray! And we started this brand new organization called the United Nations. And the British are like, hey, UN, remember that Palestine problem I created after the last war? Catch! And then the English fuck all the way off and let this brand new organization comprised of a bunch of countries that just got out of a devastating war try to solve this unsolvable territory problem the Brits created a couple decades earlier. They come up with a plan. They're like, we're going to keep the holy site of Jerusalem under international leadership so everybody can have access to it. And then we'll give the 600,000 Jews in the area 2/3 of the territory with some good farmland and good buildable area. And then we'll give the 1.2 million Arabs the rest of it. Then the Arabs were like, that math isn't mathin' real good for us. And the Jews were like, nah, we like it, it's good. And so the Jews jump on it right away, and they declare themselves the independent state of Israel. And the Arabs were like, the fuck you do? And then Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan declare war on the Palestinian area and the state of Israel. So these were big regional powers with formidable armies, and nobody really expected Israel to win. But they did, and they ended up taking even more territory than the original shitty agreement allotted them in the first place. So the U.S. jumped on this immediately because Israel would never have been able to hold the territory long term without our help. And we never passed up a chance to stick our military hardware in other people's places. So the war never really had a concrete resolution. It'd just go cold to hot for decades to come. It'd break out into real wars, and then there's just kind of like terrorism attacks from both sides. Through all of this, you get a bunch of Palestinian people who become refugees from Israel living in Gaza. These are people without a country. They've got no place to go, and Israel basically punishes them for existing in this territory that they sort of just shoved them into. Israel pretty much regulates their access to food, clean water, electricity, and they don't get a whole lot of any of it. On top of that, Israel keeps illegally building settlements in their territory. There's a lot of parallels between the US and natives and reservations. So there's never been a lot of love between these two neighbors. So then you get people who understandably get radicalized in these situations. And these radicalized people, in this case Hamas, carry out terrorist attacks, at least in part, against the civilian population of their oppressors. To be clear, Hamas is not the people of Palestine, it's just a terror group. And then Israel, who's who's armed to the teeth with American hardware, decides to respond, which is understandable in this situation. But they end up doing the same shit and killing innocent civilians because they're bombing an area the size of Philadelphia with a population a third larger than Philadelphia. So this is a humanitarian crisis for like a ton of reasons. And one we've let get to this point because we've largely ignored what Israel's been doing, because if you're critical of them, you're often accused of being anti-Semitic. That's the problem with tying a state to a religion. But let's be very clear here. You can criticize the state of Israel and its actions without criticizing the Jewish faith and its people. What they've been doing is super fucked up. Responding with terrorism that kills innocent people, also fucked up. But with Israel's actions for decades, this was really the only plausible outcome that was going to happen. And unfortunately, the people who are going to suffer is just innocent Palestinian and Israeli people. There is really no good solution to this whole situation. But in my opinion, the best way to start would be hearkening back to the days of Jimmy Carter's Camp David Accords. Bring all the leadership from the affected people in the region, except for Netanyahu. That fascist needs to be replaced with somebody who's not a fascist. Bring him to a neutral place and let the US or the UN act as a marriage counselor. Let them work out an agreement that they all feel suits them the best. Have them sign on the dotted line, and then that agreement should be enforced by the full weight of the United Nations. Israel steps out of line and violates the agreement, the United Nations puts them back in their place. Palestine steps out of line, the United Nations puts them back in their place. That's my pie-in-the-sky idea with all of my zero foreign policy experience, but I don't know, that could be completely unattainable. However you cut it, this is a very bad situation with no black and white, good guys and bad guys, and as of now, it's likely only going to get worse before it gets better, if it ever gets better. And unfortunately, a lot of innocent people have suffered and will continue to suffer through this.